Dilma on the top of Daf Lamed Gimel and Beis, Malchus Chamor. Maybe Malchus is more Chamor than Misa, which means that if you got a Hasra for Misa, that would not cover you for Malchus, even if I hold Musul Dover Chamor, I mean Musul Dover Kal, because Malchus is more Chamor and Misa is more Kal. And this we're going to derive from three of my buddies. Well, two of the three, anyway. Hananya, Mishael, and don't forget Azariah. The Omer Rav Ilmoli, the Omer Rav says Ilmoli Nigdua Hananya, Mishael, Azariah, Polchu Salma. Amazing to me that we read this Gemara on the day after Kinos of Tisha B'Av, because in the Kinos of Tisha B'Av, in those Kinos that address the Crusades, you see that torture was so, a person would rather die than be tortured. And Rav is saying that if Nebuchadnezzar had chosen to torture Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, they would have succumbed and they would have worshipped the idol. And he himself was the idol, actually. However, they understood that they were going to be put to death. They couldn't tolerate torture. But we see that in the minds of a person, in his emotional structure, Yisurim are even more chamor than Misa. I'd rather die than suffer this torture. And therefore, if I had a choice between 39 Malchus and Misa, I'd rather die. Amalei Rav Sama, again, a deep psychology. Braid Rav Ashi, Rav Ashi, the Amrillah, let's say Rav Sama, Braid Rav Ashi, Rav Ashi. V'lo shonilach bein hakash eyesh ba kitzva, lakash ein ba kitzva. If Nebuchadnezzar had chosen to beat up Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah and torture them, that would be ein lo kitzva. Psychologically, they couldn't take it. They would know that there's no end. Whereas 39 Malchus is 39 and not 40. And a person could suffer and tolerate 39 as long as yesh lo kitzva, he knows where it's going to end. Maskif lo Rav Yaakov Minahar Pekod. Here's another objection against Rav Shisha. Hanicha, Rav Shisha says, I can understand. Lirabonon. Di Amri Nefesh Mamish. So here we have a machlokes between Rebbe and the Rabbanon as to how to understand the pasuk Nefesh Achas Nofesh. The Rabbanan hold Nefesh Mamish, that if they killed the woman, then they will be put to death, because the Rabbanan hold Niskavin Larog Zev Harges Zechayah. And therefore, Rav Shisha makes a lot of sense when he says, I have a proof that Mishalim Veinoloke, because they had Asra Lemisa, otherwise, how could they be put to death? Died. And that Hasra Lemisa covers even Malchus. And yet, the Torah says that if she doesn't die but survives, they pay Onosh Yonesh Mevlados. El Rebbe Diamar Momon, Rebbe says, then is Kavi Laragos Zev Hargaz Zev Potu. So what does it mean that Lo Yeh Ason and then Onosh Yonesh, but Im Yeh Ason Nefesh Tachas Nofesh? And the answer is that Nefesh Tachas Nefesh means Mama. And we've seen a precedent for this in the pasuk of Ayin Tachas Ayin, which literally translates literally as eye for an eye, and yet we interpret it as Mama. Here too, Nefesh Tachas Nefesh means Mama. But now it comes out that there wasn't even a Havamina here to put this Nogei Fisha Hara to death, because we're holding now this Kavin Lara Gazeh, according to Rebbe, is Potter. So even in an event that Chas v'Shalom she dies, then there's no Misa. So what are we talking about? We're talking about Mama. What does that mean, Mama? We spoke about Dmei Vlados in a case where she survived. Now we're talking about a case where she didn't survive. So what's the Mama here? And the answer is that's called Dmei Isha Liarsheha. that there's actually a monetary payment for killing somebody. Again, who's the money going to go to? You've already killed them. It's going to go to their Yorshim, and we're going to shots up how much she was worth on the market, so to speak, as a, sold as a shivcha. And that's what the Torah means. Im yeh ason, if she dies, anosh ye'onesh. And what is that onesh? In the case where she dies, nefesh takas nefesh, that's mamon, to me isha liyarsheha. If on the other hand she survives, then they paid Dmei Vlados for the Vlad that died. So now we could say that there was no Asra at all. Because again, the Torah is not even discussing a case of a capital punishment for murder. So there was no Asra. And if there's no Asra, there's no possibility of giving him Malchus for violating Baal Tosif. And therefore he pays Dmei Isha. But Enochinami. According to this objection of Yaakov, if there were to have been a hasra, then Enochinami, there would be no payment to Dmei Vlados, because we would apply the principle of Loka V'Ena Mishali. But you can't prove from this, Michael Maper, how do you know that Chova B'Chavero, if there was hasra for Malchus, you pay Mammon and you don't get Malchus. In truth, if there was hasra, you would get Malchus without paying Mammon. So now, according to Rav Yaakov, that we've slugged up the derivation of Rav Shisha, we have to find a substitute. How do we derive that in Chovel B'Chavero, even in a case where you could give Malchus and there was Asra, nevertheless, we alleviate the Malchus and we make him pay Mama. Rav Yaakov, and now we're looking at a different parsha, also in Mishpatim, about what's called Umdana. In the Gemara's language here, it's going to be called by a different name, Chovshenosa. Okay. So what happens here? Ruvain deliberately smites, is there such a word in English? Smites Shimon. Shimon is wobbling. Will he survive? We don't know. So for that, we do what's called Chovshenosa. Chovshenosa means we take Ruvain, the perpetrator of the crime, and we lock him up, and we see what happens to Shimon, the victim. It says, "V'kiyeruvin yerivun anoshim v'hikoi chesreu b'eveno be'egro falo yamus v'nafal mishkov." So Ruvain hits Shimon with a stone. Shimon now is locked up in a hospital room. Im Yaakov ishalech bachutz al mishanto. If at some point he is able to stand on 2 feet, holding, if you will, a cane, then the Torah says, "V'nika amak." Then we know that the Makkah, we call him Ruvain, is not guilty of murder. What do you mean he's not guilty of murder? Nobody died. The Torah had to go out of its way to add this whole parasha of V'nika amak if nobody died. I mean, in American law, I believe there's something called attempted crime, attempted murder. But in halacha, there's no such thing as putting a person to death for an attempted murder. He didn't succeed. What's the hava meaning that the Torah has to tell me? V'nika amak. Ela malamed, but rather chovshenoso. We lock up the makkah in a jail. And let's see what happens with the victim. If the victim dies, katlinanle, we'll take the makkah out to be killed. The lomis, now here the Torah says, shivto yitain, v'rapo yirape. And this is what we discussed earlier. that there's a chiyuv compensation for dmei chavola, sheves, ripui, etc. If you don't lo asu my miktal, why are you going to tell me that if the victim dies, then we take the perpetrator of the crime out of the Beis Chavushim and we put him to death? What do you mean put him to death? There was no asra. Ella, we have no choice. By process of elimination, we gave him asra. Now the Gemara is going to utilize the same svar as Rav Shisha. So therefore, he has asra for Malchus. Because again, Chov also, and if he would have died, we put the perpetrator to death. So it must be that there was Hasra. And Hasra for Misa operates for a Dover Kal, which is Hasra for Malchus. He has to pay Mama. So we see clearly that even though there was Hasra, and in this case, Hasra is Chal vis-a-vis Malchus, nevertheless, we apply the principle of Mama Yishalim, lucky, Milka lo lucky. Once again, we're going to have the whole Chakravatari that we had before. You could basically copy and paste the previous Gemara that we saw in Amid Aleph here in Amid Beis, Maskefla Rav Ashi. Mimai de Musul Dover Chomer Musul Dover Kal Dilma Lo. Imtim Salomer Mimai. V'imtim Salomer. And even if you say Havi that Musul Dover Chomer Musul Mimai, how do you know that Misa is Chamura Dilma Malchus Chomer Diomer Avi Ilmole Nigdu Alachrani Vishov Azari Pochel Tzalma. So now the Gemara is going to defend Rav Yaakov Minar Pkod based on a statement of Rav Sama. Amalei Rav Sama Breder of Asi, the Rav Ashi, Amalei Rav Sama Breder of Ashi, the Rav Ashi, Lo Shani Loch, Hakah Ben Hakah, Sheyesh Ba Kitzvah, Hakah Shein Ba Kitzvah. You're right, to some extent, theoretically, on the pyramid of Chumrah Ha'onesh, we could put Malchus on the top of the pyramid. But that's because it's a lo kitzvah. But in the case of Hakah, 39 Malchus, yesh lo kitzvah, then for sure, a person would rather suffer the 39 Malchus than be put to death. Maskefla of Mari. Now the Gemara has another objection to Rav Yaakov. Rav Yaakov's assumption was that the whole parsha of Hirivun Anoshim Hika Ishas Reyeu B'Evan over Egrof is talking about a mason. And the subject of this parsha is whether we put him to death as a murderer. No. We're not talking about a mason. We're talking about a shogeg. And the subject of this parsha is Golus. Mimai to be mason Vinika means that if the victim walks on his feet, then he's potter, the perpetrator of the crime is potter miktola. We don't put him to death. Dilma perhaps b'shogeg. And what does it mean for nika makeh? That if the victim survives, then the makeh is nika migolus. He doesn't go to golus. So we have to do a chovshin also. We're going to have to lock up the perpetrator and see what are the results and what happens to the victim. If in event the victim dies, then the perpetrator has to go to Golus, right until the death of the Kohen Gadol. Kash. Where it says, I don't have an answer to this question. There's no way you can prove that we're talking about Chovel B'Chavero and he got a Hasra for Misa, and Hasra for Misa is Chal as Hasra for Malchus, and he could have gotten Malchus, but instead the Torah says, Michalim, no, all that is out. Because the subject of this parsha is not a hasra, but on the contrary, the absence of hasra, and that's called shogeg. So if we're dealing with a shogeg, so what's kovchino? So what's going to be the worst punishment that we're going to meet out to with shogeg? And the answer is he's going to be chayav golus. Why? Because of a ma'aser ritzicha, and obviously in the absence of hasra, because otherwise he's amazing, not a shogeg. Now, at this point, we want to do a quick review as an introduction to the rest of the daf of the stira that we had between the Mishnah here in Ksubas and the Mishnah in Masechet Makos. And the case was ba alachosa. Our Mishnah here in Ksuba says he pays knas, and the Mishnah in Makkah says he gets malchus. And we had various attempts to try to reconcile this Mishnah. The two Mishnayos, we had Ula, we had Rabbi Yochanan, now we have Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish Amar Ha-Mani, who is the author of our Mishnah that says that he pays knas? Rabbi Meir. But wait a second, what do you mean he pays knas? He's chayiv malchus, bo'al achosam. Okay, so we had answers, maybe there was no asra and so forth and so on. But let's assume there was asra for malchus. Says Rabbi Meir, he will get malchus. At the same time, he'll pay the knas. To Yomar Loke Mishal. We've had various opinions whether Loke Vieda Mishal and Veno Loke. Now we have Rabbi Meir, who appears in the Mishnah in Makkos on Daf Dalid, Loke U Mishal. And that's the case of Edom Zomimim, who tried to force Reuven to pay money to Shimon. Then they came out, turns out that they're Zomimim. They will pay the money under Kasher Zomam, and they'll get Malchus under Losan. And in the language of Rabbi Meir in the Mishnah, Lo Hashem HaMavil L'dei Mama Mavil L'dei Malchus. There are two different shemos, two different machayvim that overlap. There's a machayv of Kasher Zomam, and there's a machayv of Losan Abriachet Shok. And we'll give them both. Misa and Malchus. I'm sorry, Mammon and Malchus. Mammon b'toras Kasher Zomam, and Malchus for violating the law of Penyos. I'm sorry, for violating the law of Losan Abriachet Shok. So on this Gemara of Reish Lakish, there's a very fascinating Shita Mekubetzes here quoted in the Mesifta. And the Shita asks the obvious question. It's a very powerful question against the Gemara. There are two Mishnayos. Our Mishnah in Masechet Ketuvot says Knas, he pays Knas. It doesn't say a word about Malchus. The Mishnah in Masechet Makkos says that he gets Malchus. There's not even a word about Knas. Sorry about that. So the Shita Mekubetzes wants to say that each Mishnah, both of which are authored by Rabbi Meir, who holds Mammon and Malchus, emphasizes a different point. The Mishnah here in Ksubis is emphasizing the Chiyuv Knas, as if to say it was understood that he'll get Malchus for having this relationship with his own sister. But the Chiddush is that you shouldn't think that therefore we're going to exempt him from Knas, from Mammon. The Mishnah in Makkos, on the other hand, is interested in a different Chiddush, and that is that although the punishment for the crime is kares in Balachotza, but nevertheless, if he had Asra for Malchus, he gets Malchus. That's a different Kiddush. And that belongs to Masechet Makkos, where we're dealing with the Chiyuvim of Malchus. The Mishnah in Makkos is not interested in raising the question of Knas, because that belongs to Masechet Ksubis. Frekta Gemara, I Rabbi Meir Afilu Bitonami, the next Mishnah that we're going to have here in Ksubis, on Daf Lamed Vav Amud Beis, says that in Baal Bito, there is no Knas. Why not? If Rabbi Meir rejects the concept of Kimle b'Ramine, and he's willing to slap you down with both a physical, corporeal punishment at the same time, a monetary compensation, that even in the case of Baal Bito, he should be chayav Knas. Maybe you'll answer the following. There are two different levels or dinim of Kimle b'Ramine. There's one Malchus and Mammon, and then there's Misa and Mammon. And Rabbi Meir Lokim Shalim Islay, he rejects the application of Kimle b'Ramine in the case of Malchus and Mammon, but Mesa Mishalim Leslie, he admits that there's no overlap of both a capital punishment of Misa and a monetary punishment of mama. And again, it's just on a very technical level. What the Gemara is suggesting is that in the relationship between Mammon and Malchus, there's almost like an equation. There's no reason why one is going to swallow up the other. But in Misa and Mammon, then for sure, the Onish Misa will swallow up and completely trump the Chi of Mammon. And the Gemara rejects this. Velo. It's impossible to maintain that distinction. And why not? But Tanya, we have a brisa, and this brisa is going to occupy us for quite a while. Ganav v'tovach b'Shabbos, ganav v'tovach l'avodas kom, ganav v'shar niskal u'tvacho. Mishalim tashlume arba v'chamisha divrei Rabbi Meir. Again, the Chacham Pochim we'll get to a little bit later, but let's just focus on Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says that in all these cases where he's chayav misa, nevertheless, he pays what's called arba v'chamisha, right? A ganav is chayav kefel, and if he stole a shar and then shechted the animal, or sold the animal, then he has to pay an additional 2 or 3, depending on whether it's a shar or a seh, all told 4 or 5 times the original price. Now, in the case of tvicha, when he shechts the stolen animal, if he shechts it with a shchita kshera, again, he's a ganav, I don't know if I want to eat from a shchita, but anyway, technically his shchita is shchita kshera. So for a shchita kshera, you pay the extra shtaymo shlosha, meaning up to dalve. Comes Rabbi Meir, and he says that if he shechts the animal, this ganav, on Shabbos, all the shem avodas kolchavim, or a shara niskal, then in all these cases he has to pay daled vehei. Now, in the first 2 cases, forgetting about shara niskal for a moment, when he shechts on Shabbos, which is one of the Lamites Malachos, or he shechts avodas kolchavim, which is also a chiyuv misa. In both these cases of Shabbos and avodas kolchavim, there's a chiyuv misa. And for deswegen, according to Rabbi Meir, he's going to pay daled vehei. So basically, there are 2 chidushim here in Rabbi Meir, one piled on top of the other. One chiddush is that we recognize this shchita on Shabbos or l'shem avodas kolchavim as a valid shchita to generate a chiyuv daled vehei, because in order for a shchita of a ganav to generate daled vehei, it's got to be a valid shchita that's matir the basar b'achila. But you would have said, perhaps that's why the Chacham disagree over here, that this shchita is not a valid shchita, because a shchita which violates Shabbos is not a shchita. It doesn't matter. It's not matter the basar. Certainly, in the case of a shchita avodas kolchavim, which generates an isur anah, or cherem lo yochal, etc., is therefore it's not a valid shchita to generate daled vehei. So that's chiddush number 1 of Rabbi Meir, which the Gemara is going to analyze. But there's another chiddush here, Rabbi Meir, that even though he's chayav misa, nevertheless he pays daled vehei. So you see that Rabbi Meir is a total rejection of kimlei b'derabmin, whether it's malchus and misa or misa and mammon. I'm sorry, whether it's malchus and mammon or misa and mammon. Chachamim potrim. Okay, we'll come back to the Chachamim. They say you don't pay daled vehei. This is what you call shchita sheina ru'uya. It's not matter the basar, and therefore it doesn't generate daled vehei. That we'll get to as a separate topic, but we want to focus our attention on Rabbi Meir, and here Rabbi Meir explicitly commits himself to the position that you get misa and mammon, and there's no kimlei b'derabmin. So your answer before, to try to defend a distinction between misa and mammon and malchus and mammon is not correct. In both cases, Rabbi Meir goes down the line consistently, and he holds that you get both misa and mammon. So therefore, in the case of Baal Bito, even though he's going to be chayav misa, nevertheless he still has to pay the knas. And therefore, if our Mishnah here in the beginning of Elunaris is to be attributed to Rabbi Meir, the Mishnah should have added Baal Bito. And the Gemara answers, Mar Allah, Rabbi Yaakov, Rabbi Yochanan, Rabbi Yirmiyah, Rabbi Shimon, Rabbi Oven, Rabbi Ilah, V'chol Chaburasa, Mishmei Rabbi Yochanan, V'toveach al Yidei Acher. He sent a shliach to do the tvicha. So Reuven stole the shar. He appoints Shimon to implement a shchita on the shar. And here, the Gemara is going to differentiate between two different dinim. One is the chi of misa for violating the Shabbos or avodah zarah, and the other is the chi of mammon of payment to Daled Vehei. We're going to apply the principle of shliach here in order to be mechayev Reuven, the Ganav, Daled Vehei. We will not apply the principle of shlichus to be mechayev Reuven misa for violating the Shabbos or for violating a shchita avodah zarah. He didn't do the shchita. Shimon did the shchita. Shimon will die condemned to death for violating the Shabbos or for violating avodah zarah, assuming there was asra. He'll say, Shimon, I'm just a shliach. Right? Remember obedience theory from Psychology 1.1, if you took the first course in psychology, right? I was just being obedient, right? That was the argument of the Nazis. We were just, carrying out orders. No. Ein shliach l'dvar avera. However, as far as Daled Vehei is concerned, the Ganav is chayav if he had the animal slaughtered, whether he himself slaughtered the animal or he appointed someone as a shliach to kill, to shech the animal. The Gemara says, "V'chizeh chote v'zem is chayav." Wait a second. The Gemara says that just like misa for violating Shabbos is an onesh, the payment of Daled Vehei is also an onesh. It's also a penalty for a crime. Who committed the crime? Well, Shimon did the shchita. Let him pay the Daled Vehei. Zeh chote v'zeh meshalem mischayev knas, meaning Reuven sent Shimon. Shimon did the Maisa Vera of Tficha, and Shimon is now going to be off the hook as far as paying Daled Vehei is concerned. And now we're going to be Mechayev Reuven. I mean, Shimon is the Chote because ain't Shliach L'Dvar Vera. Omar Rav, Omar Achmana, Utvacho O Mecharo. And this is a classic drasha. The Gemara always derives the alfusa from the extra word O. Because even had it said in the pasuk utvacho umecharo, we would have interpreted that vav as a vav hamachalik as an o. Furthermore, from the fact that the pasuk in one breath mentions tvicha and mechira, there must be a certain similarity between the two. Ma mechira al yedei acher. How do you sell something? You can't sell it as a solo effort, right? You need a kona, you need someone to buy it. So the Maisa Mechira is a partnership of both the Mocher and the Lokeach. And yet the Mocher is Chayiv Daled Vehei if he's a Gan. Again, it's a little bit strange of an equation because in the case of Mechira, the Ganav is personally involved in the Mechira, albeit he needs the kona. But apparently the Gemara shifts all the emphasis here and the weight on the Lokeach who makes the kinyan. So how could you, the Mocher, the Ganav, be chayav for the Mechira, which was really in effect implemented by the Lokeach? And so to in Tvicha, if you send a Shliach with Tvicha, you're chayav Daled Vehei. So this is a special Gzeres HaKosuv that removes Tvicha Mechira V'Ganav from the parsha of Ein Shliach L'Dvar Avera. In fact, the Gemara Kedushin on Daf Mem Gimel and Aleph has other cases where we suspend the principle of Ein Shliach L'Dvar Avera. For example, the case of Me'ila Behegdesh. If Reuven takes Hegdesh, Duchas Domin, and he appoints Shimon to be Moel, to use that Hegdesh for his own personal purpose, then Reuven Shalech is Chayim. Then we have another case called Shlichas Yad B'Pikadon, which means that Reuven was mafkid an animal in the hands of Shimon. If Shimon is Sholeach Yad, if he uses that object and he's a Shomer, then he's Michayev HaShliach Yad V'Yikod. In fact, one of the shvuos that a Shomer has to take in order to exempt himself from payment if the animal's lost is Shalosh Shalachti Bo Yad. But here, instead of the Shomer himself doing the Shlichas Yad V'Yikod, he appointed someone else. And the Gemara has here what's called Shnei Ksubim Shein Hambam Kechen Ein Malamdin, and then the Gemara thinks that, but if there are 3 psukim, maybe it would be Malamed, and that's the whole sugi in Kiddushin Daf Mem Gimel. The Bei Rabbi Shmuel Tana O, the extra word O is always used as a ribuy l'rabos es hashliach. The Bei Chizkiya Tana Tachas. It says Chamisha Bakar Yishalim Tachas Hashor, Arba Tzon Tachas Haser. What's the extra word tachas? The rabos is hashliach. So again, as we said before, we suspend the normal universal principle of Eichlich and Varavera in the case of Tvicha Mechir. Maskif Lo Mar Zutra. Okay. So now Mar Zutra introduces another element into the equation. We've circumvented the problem of Ein Shliach L'Dvar Vera, and we validated the Shlichus to explain why Rabbi Meir holds that the Ganav is Chayev Dal Vehei when he appoints Shimon, as we called him, as a Shliach for Tvicha Mechir. However, Mar Zutra points out that we have another technical reason to undermine this Shlichus for Tvicha Mechira. And that reason is as follows. The Mishaleach could only benefit and utilize Shlichus if he himself could have done the action. A Shliach is the extended arm of the Mishaleach in the sense of the following, that if the Mishaleach could have done the action, he could now transfer his bailus over the action to the shliach and say, look, I'm the bailim over this action. The Torah recognizes my ability to implement this action. I am now going to appoint you as my proxy to implement that action. But if the Mishalech himself could not do the action, and again, when we're talking about doing the action, let me clarify that. I don't mean the physical action. I mean the chalos, the legal repercussions of the action. If the Mishalech himself, Ruvain, appoints Shimon as a shliach in a case where he, Ruvain, was mufka, he was excluded from the chalos of that maisa, he can't give that chalos over to Shimon and transfer bailus and say, Mr. Shliach, my proxy, you take over my bailus, because he doesn't have any bailus. So therefore, Mar Zutra says, how can you tell me that Rabbi Meir is talking about a case of Tvachal al Yedei Acher, and the Acher was a Shliach? Mika midi the ilu ovad iu lo mechayek, the ovad shliach umechayek, had the Mishalech, we'll call him Ruvain, implemented this action, then he'd be potter. Why would it be potter? Because Vicha is one of the malachos of Shabbos, and it occurs a Chiv Misa. And the Chiv Misa would knock off the Chiv Mammon. He would not pay Dalet Vehei. That meant he wouldn't even pay Kefa. And again, we're holding now, at this point in the Gemara, that even though Reb Meir says, Mishalem Viloke, but he admits that Eno Chayev Misa Umama. So we're going to apply Kimlev Rabbi. So therefore, the Ganav is off the hook if he himself shechts the animal because he's Chayev Misa, and the Misa is going to knock off the Chayev Mama. Now, the truth is, I have to tell you, Rabbi Osai, I didn't think that this was a valid question, which I'm going to try to explain it. I'm going to try to push in my logic into the Gemara. And you're the jury. Kim Levi the Rabbi Minei doesn't mean that you're not chayav. Kim Levi the Rabbi Minei addresses Bezdin who are in charge of implementing punishments with a restrictive rule that says you can only impose one punishment per crime, right? You get a ticket for the laundry, you could only go with that ticket once, get on the bus, You, Bezdin, cannot for one Maisa Machayev impose two punishments. But it doesn't mean that the perpetrator of the crime is exempt from paying mama. We'll call it a theoretical obligation to pay that mama. If fall, in actuality, we cannot implement that mama because we're going to put him to death for the capital crime. And that's what I think I could read into the Gemara. I don't know. Iu lav mishum de lo mechayev. There's a double negative here. Don't say that he's not chayev, meaning that if Ruvain himself, the Ganav, would have shechted the animal on Shabbos, don't tell me that Ruvain is not chayev to pay daled vehe. He is chayev to pay daled. El mishum de kimle de ramimina, which I think addresses Bezdin and tells Bezdin that your arms are tied here and you can't implement a chiyuv mamon of daled vehe because you're too busy and preoccupied with killing Ruvain as a violator of Shabbos. Now the Gemara asks the following kasha: Rabbanan say that you're potter from daled vehe, and why? I mean, Shimon was the one who did Shimon the Shliach. Did the Maisa Tvicha. And therefore, Ruvain, the Mishaleach, the Ganav, he should be Chayiv Daled Vehe. And here's where we get into the sugya that I mentioned earlier in passing of Tvicha Re'uya. Did this Shechita matir the boss? And now the Gemara is going to enter into an entire sugya, which we'll cover tomorrow at about 1:20, whatever time I'll let you know. And that is that you need a tvicha re'uya, and if you shecht an animal on Shabbos, it's not necessarily a tvicha re'uya, which would be matir the boss. And the Gemara says, Man chachamim, here on the top of Lamed Daled, Rabbi Shimoni diyamar shchita she'ena re'uya lo shmei shchita. And the Gemara is going to try to prove that if chas v'sholom, a person shechts an animal on Shabbos, that shechita is not valid. It's called a shechita she'ena re'uya. And such a shechita would not generate a chiyuv of daled vehe because lo shmei shechita. Therefore, that shechita could not generate a chiyuv daled vehe because the shechita was implemented on Shabbos. And on Shabbos, the shechita is not a valid shechita. Now, you and I would have said, okay, on Shabbos, you're not allowed to shecht, and if he shechts with asra, etc., he gets mitzvah, but the basar you're allowed to eat. I mean, the shechita was a valid shechita name. Says Rabbi Shimon, this is called a shechita she'ena re'uya, and it's not valid as a shechita. The Torah doesn't recognize it as shechita, and it's not matir the basar. Hence, the ganav will not incur a chiyuv of daled vehe. Again, keep in mind that fundamentally, we had three different drashos from which we derive the validity of shlichus in the case of daled vehe, such that the ganav who appointed the shliach to shech the animal would be chayiv daled vehe, but not on Shabbos. And that's for a different reason, because daled vehe is generated by a shechita, but it says Rabbi Shimon it's got to be a shechita re'uya, and Shabbos is not a shechita re'uya. And this is going to be the segue into the famous sugya that appears at least 2 or 3 times in Shas that I remember, and that is Maisa Shabbos. Does the Torah recognize a Maisa Shabbos? Okay, then. So I'll bid you a good day and shkoyach. Thank you so much.